Thanks so much for continuing in this journey of exploration on the duality of leadership. I'm really glad that you're continuing our conversation. Last time in the previous video, I talked with you a little bit about the scriptural principles and the scriptural anchoring that we always seek to do in our conversations. And I shared with you that as God has made us, He has made us in a duality of sorts. In other words, there are two parts of what makes you up. There is the identity and there is your mission and activity. We explored 1 Peter 2:9 as one single verse that represents many verses throughout Scripture that seem to lead us to understand how God has made you and how God has made you with an identity that manifests itself in your activity and mission through your vocation. So I hope that you were able to take some time with your small group or perhaps with coworkers at work and exploring how that manifests itself in your life and understanding clearly the identity of who you are and how that lives itself out in the mission of what you do and how your activities are always drawn from the core identity. Remember that it's much more integrated in real life than I'm making it sound. I'm just trying to decouple these things and I'm trying to clarify these things so that you understand how important one is to the other. So I'm really glad that you're continuing in this exploration, understanding that there is much under this that comes from God who has created you, and that this helps you to live out your professional, vocational calling with a much higher level of confidence and clarity that is focused on fulfilling your mission. I promised you last time that I was going to talk with you a little bit about a metaphor to try to explain this duality of leadership. And again, this is not about the dualism, the philosophical dualism that you learned about in Philosophy 101 in college or in school. This is very simply a duality of personhood and leadership, basically simply saying that God made us in two dimensions or with two components that are inextricably tied together and very interdependent one on the other, so that you can manifest your calling in this world with a much higher level of confidence and effectiveness. So let me talk to you about a metaphor that I'm hoping will help to explain this in visual form and bring it home in our understanding. So if I were to draw this shape for you, of course, the first thing that you would say is, that's a triangle. Well, yes, it is. But if I add to this a very important line here, now it looks like something very different. Now, assuming you see water there, you'll understand that this isn't just a triangle, this is an iceberg. Now, I understand that icebergs are not perfect isosceles triangles, that icebergs are all different shapes and they look different and so forth and so on. But for purposes of analogy and understanding, let's imagine this to be an iceberg. And I'm told by icebergologists, if there is such a thing, that 10% of the iceberg is above the waterline, which leaves clearly 90% beneath the waterline. And that's true of any iceberg, as I'm told. Now, a vast majority of this iceberg then is unseen, and clearly we've learned about that throughout history, and the example of the people on the Titanic discovered that firsthand clearly to their own demise, because they realized that the iceberg is much bigger under the waterline than it is above the waterline where we can see. 10% of it is above the waterline. 10% of it is in what I call the visible arena, and 90% is in the unseen arena or realm. Now, notice that I don't use the same word. It's not that it's invisible, it's just unseen. It's very real. It's not a phantom. It exists. It's just that it can't be seen because there's water that's covering it. It's in the hidden arena. It exists. It's very real. It just can't be seen by people who are walking by or sailing by. So the top of the iceberg or the tip of the iceberg is visible. but most of the iceberg can't be seen. Notice, again, the duality that we're talking about. There are two dimensions to this iceberg, but it is one iceberg alone. There again, you see this duality of personhood, this duality of leadership. One in the visible arena, one component in the unseen arena. Now, let's imagine that this iceberg is you. And this iceberg represents the people that you work with at work or at the church, the people you're ministering to, or the people that you're trying to lead. Imagine that this iceberg is you, and you can certainly apply this principle to others that you are in leadership with or in relationship with. This iceberg represents you. There's a top of the iceberg and a bottom of the iceberg. There's a part of the iceberg that's in the visible arena, things that you do that people see. And then there are things in the secret places of who you are that people cannot see. The top of this iceberg then represents your activity. The bottom represents your identity. Now, I think you're probably beginning to see the correlation with the previous video that I did with you, the previous session that we had together from 1 Peter 2:9. The top represents your task or your mission, and the bottom represents your nature, and it represents more of who you are. The top of the iceberg represents your competence, and the bottom represents your character, you see. Top and bottom of the iceberg. Who you are and what you do. So if I were to then begin to talk with you about this iceberg, you see, this answers the question of who am I? And the top of the iceberg answers the question, what am I here to do? Now you're beginning to see this differentiated understanding of the duality of your leadership and those around you. Most of what people see of you, most of what the world sees of you, is the top of the iceberg. And your relationship and your interaction with your work environment, with the people around you, is going to be at the top of the iceberg level. It will be through activities. It will be through performance. It will be through behavior. And the 90% of the iceberg that's beneath the waterline is largely unseen by these people. So when they assess you, when they evaluate you, when they draw judgments about you, it will be based upon what they see you do in the top of the iceberg. Now, what's important here is, remember what I said, there are two component parts, but there's one iceberg. And the bottom is your character, your nature, your identity. The top is your competence, your task, your activity. Most of the seminars that you go to are trying to teach you how to do something better. That's a top of the iceberg activity. How to make decisions better, how to lead a group better, how to engage conflict better, how to design strategy better, how to establish vision better. Most of the seminars that we go to are focused on top of the iceberg activities as a way to interact and interface with the people around us that we lead. And yet, we've got to understand that most of who you are is not in the top of the iceberg. It's in the bottom of the iceberg. That has to do with your character. If I were to apply Christian language to this, or Christian terminology, the top of the iceberg represents your gifts for your work. The bottom of the iceberg represents the fruit of God, the fruit of the Spirit, addressing who you are. Now remember, this is one iceberg in two dimensions. And what's important about the relationship between the top and the bottom is that we always behave out of who we are. You see, our behavior and our activity interfaces with people and systems and culture in the visible arena, and so we are interacting at the top of the iceberg level. But our actions are always informed by our identity, our nature, our character, the fruit of the Spirit within you. We act as a reflection of our identity. Our task, our performance, our competence is a reflector of our character, our identity, and our nature. So you see, these two component parts of the iceberg are inextricably woven together, one with the other. As we talked about in the scriptural passage, we are who we are so that we may do what we are called to do. And when we act and do our activity, we do so out of who we are. As a leader, then, when you engage with the people around you and the systems that you're leading and the people that you're working with, whether you know it or not, your identity is shaping, informing, giving texture and depth to your activity. It's shaping it in nuanced ways so that your nature, your character, your identity is finding expression in your activity. Now, what's really important to know is that because people assess us or look at us at the top of the iceberg level, all of the assessment systems that we have, whether it's in education or business or the church, doesn't matter where, all of the leadership assessment systems we have are designed to evaluate the top of the iceberg. And that can become problematic because we know that we usually live up to what is examined in us. It's kind of like students in a classroom. When the teacher tells them what is going to be on the test, what do you think they're going to study? When they have a hunch that the exam is going to include chapters 5, 9, and 12, what do you think they're going to study? Which leaves everything else out. Because we tend to behave in a manner that will best fulfill the expectations that are put upon us. Well, the same thing is true here. When you know you're going to be evaluated on how you make decisions, on how you do your job, on how you spend your time, on whether you accomplish your objectives, and whether or not you're in alignment with the mission, a lot of that is going to come at the top of the iceberg level. So our assessment systems in all of our structures and organizations are designed to evaluate you in the top of the iceberg. And if we're not careful, suddenly we begin to put more time and energy into the top of our iceberg than the bottom. We begin to focus on making sure that our activity is perfected to please others. We begin to focus more on 10% of who we are than on the 90% of who God made us to be. Now, I want to show you also a connection between these two things that's very important. Right now, I told you that 10% is above the waterline and 90% is beneath the waterline. Now, notice the relationship between these things. It takes this amount of iceberg to keep this amount of iceberg above the water, to keep it afloat. What if I enlarge the bottom of the iceberg to make it bigger? What happens to the top? Well, the capacity for the top of that iceberg grows. Conversely, if I shrink the bottom of the iceberg, the capacity in the top of the iceberg shrinks as well. Now, what I mean by that is that your capacity for effectiveness in leadership in your vocation is in direct relation to the depth and formation of your identity. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have a well-formed bottom of the iceberg that you're going to be successful in your job. What it means is your capacity for effectiveness will increase to the extent that the bottom of your iceberg is deepened and well-formed. Now, effectiveness, as you know, is a very important word. It's not measured empirically only. It's not measured simply by objective data points. It's measured in a larger, more intricate economy that I like to leave to God, frankly. God's economy is different than the economy of transactional leadership in fulfilling the objectives of your business or your job. And in God's eyes, effectiveness in you, whether successful according to your job or your boss or the world, effectiveness increases in your life to the extent that you invest and deepen the bottom of the iceberg. In other words, size matters. A bottom of the iceberg that is deep and well formed gives you the capacity for incredible reach and influence in your activity and in fulfilling your vocational calling. Now, I'm going to stop here, and the next time we pick up, I want to talk with you a little bit about what I call the performance-based identity trap. And we'll get into that. But for now, I'd like you to take time in your personal reflection time and with others, perhaps at work or in your small group. Take the principle of the iceberg, and please take liberty with it. I've explained the idea, the concept. I'd like you to think about it at such a deep level that you can start taking liberties with this. Understanding this principle now, maybe you and your discussion group can take a piece of paper and draw the shape of your iceberg. It'll take some reflection, it'll take some meditation and some quiet thought. What is the shape of your iceberg right now? Assess yourself. Look inward. What does your iceberg look like? You've got the idea, top of the iceberg, bottom of the iceberg. It may be that you draw an iceberg that is very small on the bottom and very big on the top. It may be that you draw an iceberg that's very big on the bottom but has very little poking up above the waterline. It may be that you draw an iceberg where in the bottom of your iceberg there are giant pieces that have calved off or broken off. You may design an iceberg that has a giant hole in the middle because of some experience, some personal part of your story informing you. Draw your iceberg, and if you feel like you're able to do it, describe it to other people. Remember that the journey of forming your iceberg, your leadership, is yours. That's why I call all of this the journey of leadership formation. Not just development, but formation, because you are being formed. So take some time, draw the shape of your iceberg, and in your small group, if you decide you want to do this, share it with those around the table in your discussion group and see how you can learn one from another. And then next time around, we'll talk about a few more principles that apply to this duality of leadership. Thanks for being with me.